A Boeing 747 with 524 people on board spins out of control in the skies over Japan. Alarms blare in the cockpit as the pilots desperately struggle to control an aircraft that seems to have a mind of its own. Oxygen masks fall from the ceiling and terrified passengers write last-minute notes to loved ones. What caused the plane's massive tail to explode off? And will the pilots be able to coax their stricken aircraft back to the airport? This is the story of Japan Airlines Flight 123. On the evening of August 12, 1985, 509 passengers and 15 crew members boarded a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. They were bound for Osaka, about an hour to the southwest. The route was one of the busiest in Japan, with thousands of people traveling there and back every day. On this day, Flight 123 was full to bursting. It was the start of the Japanese autumn holiday season, and many of the passengers were making their annual trip back to their hometowns. Little did they know when they boarded that evening that the aircraft they were flying on was hiding a critical weakness, one that had been growing like a cancer for years, completely undetected. Today, just minutes after takeoff, it would reach its breaking point. The flight was also special for the pilots. In the captain's seat was 39-year-old First Officer Yutaka Sasi. He would be acting as captain for this flight, under the watchful eye of the actual captain. With just under 4,000 hours of experience, Sasi had been promoted to captain on the 747 after serving as First Officer for the past 6 years. Sitting to his right and supervising him was 49-year-old veteran Captain Masami Takahama. Takahama had been flying since 1966, accumulating more than 12,000 hours of experience. At this point, he had been flying the 747 for more than a decade. Sitting behind the pilots at the flight engineers station was the third crew member, 46-year-old Hiroshi Fukada. Fukada had nearly 10,000 hours as a flight engineer and was very experienced on the 747, with nearly 4,000 hours in this seat. Fukada had been flying all day. This was his third flight on this aircraft. The other two pilots had joined him for this flight after being replaced from the previous crew. With this experienced crew, the passengers could not have been in safer hands. However, the emergency, or rather emergencies, they would face that day was something the crew had never been trained for. At 5:56 that evening, Flight 123 pushed back from the gate at Tokyo. It was a sweltering summer evening and thunderstorms had been pounding the country all day. To avoid them, the pilots would fly a little south of their usual route over the sea. This flight would be a short one, so short that almost as soon as it reached its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet, it would begin to descend again. At 6:12, First Officer Sasi lined up the aircraft with the runway and applied takeoff power. Within moments, the massive jet and its 524 passengers and crew were airborne. Flight 123 climbed out over Tokyo Bay and turned slowly right towards Osaka. For the first few minutes, everything went according to plan. As the plane climbed, it began to pressurize. Air from the engines was being pushed into the cabin, so the pressure inside the cabin was greater than the pressure outside. As the plane climbed and the air outside became thinner, the pressure difference between the air inside the cabin and the air outside the cabin became greater and greater. The plane's thin aluminum skin stretched slightly as the air inside it pressed against it. This happens on every flight, and this particular aircraft, which had been flying for 11 years, had been through this cycle over 12,000 times without incident. In the cockpit, the flight engineer monitored the cabin pressure as the plane climbed out, ensuring that the air remained breathable for the passengers. But what he didn't know, and what no one else on board knew, was that the bulkhead at the rear of the plane, an umbrella-shaped structure that held in the pressurized air from the cabin, had a critical weakness. Years earlier, the plane had landed hard on its tail at Osaka, causing significant damage to this bulkhead. The damage was so severe that the plane was grounded and extensive repairs were carried out. However, the repairs to the bulkhead had not been carried out correctly. This meant that on every flight since that incident, as the plane climbed and the air inside the cabin was pressed against the bulkhead, tiny cracks began to grow. Now, after 12,319 flights, As the plane cruised high over the Pacific, this bulkhead gave way catastrophically. What you're about to see is a completely accurate recreation of the flight from this point on. The position and movement of the aircraft, as well as the audio you're about to hear, have been painstakingly imported directly from the flight data recorder of that flight. There was pandemonium on board, as the pressurized air in the cabin was forced out of the hole that had now opened up in the rear of the aircraft. This pressure wave blew off a large section of the aircraft's tail, including the rudder, the auxiliary power unit, and several other critical components and control systems. In the passenger cabin, everything that wasn't tied down was torn loose and thrown out the back of the aircraft by the torrent of air. Ceiling panels at the rear of the cabin were also torn off and thrown into the void. Passenger oxygen masks immediately fell, and passengers scrambled to attach them to their faces. In the cockpit, the cabin altitude alarm sounded, warning the pilots that the air inside the plane was now too thin to breathe. But as the pilots were about to learn, that was the least of their problems. The captain decided they had better turn back to Tokyo and land immediately. He set the transponder code to 7700, the universal distress signal. Then he instructed the first officer to turn the plane right, back towards Tokyo. Okay, it's Roger, do you want right or left? All right, right. Heading 090. But as the plane turned to the right, it began to bank far too steeply. No matter what the first officer did, he couldn't get the plane back to wing level. This pointed to an extremely worrying possibility. It suggested that the hydraulic systems that powered the plane's flight controls had lost pressure. The flight engineer watched in horror as all the hydraulic systems bled out within seconds. The flight controls had been rendered completely ineffective. The captain asked the flight engineer if it was true that the hydraulic pressure had reached zero. The pilot's worst fears were confirmed. All indications were at zero. The loss of all hydraulic power was a virtual death sentence. Without it, the pilot's controls were useless. No matter how hard they tried to use their control columns to make the plane climb, descend, or turn left or right, it wouldn't work. And the rudder on the tail, it was in even worse shape. It had been blown completely off the plane. The pilots had essentially become passengers in their own aircraft. The controller offered radar vectors to guide the crew back. For the air traffic controller, this was the first sign that this was a serious emergency. This wasn't just a plane returning with a faulty engine or a sick passenger. It was out of control. Normally, a plane's tail, or vertical stabilizer, acts like the fins on an arrow or dart, stabilizing its path through the air. Without it, Flight 123. It began to swing from side to side like a falling leaf in a phenomenon known as the Dutch roll. It was a sickening motion for the passengers, many of whom were beginning to feel ill on top of the terror of decompression. And with the rudder now gone from the aircraft, the pilots had no way of stopping this movement. But this side-to-side movement was not the only control problem the pilots faced. Without hydraulic power to move the plane's elevators, the pilots could no longer control the plane's pitch. As a result, the aircraft began to enter a terrifying roller coaster cycle. First, it pitched up and began to climb, but as it climbed, it lost speed and began to pitch back down and descend. Then, as it descended, it gained speed and began to pitch up again. This sickening cycle is known as phugoid motion, and it continued unabated, with the plane gaining and losing thousands of feet with each cycle. For the passengers, it was like something out of a nightmare. It was clear that the plane was, in the most fundamental sense, out of control. Many started writing notes to loved ones. Flight attendants rushed around the cabin, instructing passengers on how to use the oxygen masks as they paused to breathe from the few spare masks hanging from the ceiling. This picture was taken by one of the passengers on board. The chaos in the cabin continues. Here you can see a flight attendant taking oxygen from one of the spare masks. Incredibly, the pilots in the cockpit still hadn't put on their oxygen masks. They were so focused on regaining control of the plane that they hadn't even thought about it. But now hypoxia was starting to set in, and at their altitude of 24,000 feet, there is only about a third as much oxygen as there is on the ground. The pilot's ability to focus and think critically began to deteriorate, Over the next few minutes, there was less and less discussion between the crew. Tokyo Air Traffic Control called the flight, but the pilots were so mentally overwhelmed by the emergency and hypoxia that they didn't respond to the controller's calls. The rest of the air traffic in the area continued as normal, receiving their instructions from air traffic control to climb, descend, and change course. High above the Japanese countryside, the pilots of Flight 123 and their more than 500 passengers were on their own. But there was one part of the plane that the pilots could still control, the engines. So the question was, how could they use just the engines to control the plane's movement? In theory, the pilots could dampen the up and down motion of the plane by manipulating the power of the engines at just the right moments in the cycle. They could try to prevent the plane from climbing too much by reducing engine power as the plane begins to climb, and then increasing it again as the plane begins to descend. With a little trial and error, the pilots could try to get the timing just right and get the plane to fly within a much narrower range of altitudes. Once the pilots had stabilized the plane's altitude, they could begin to think of ways to dampen the plane's incessant and disgusting rolling motion. The task before them was monumental. With death staring them in the face, the three pilots, now dulled by hypoxia, would have to learn to precisely control their crippled aircraft with nothing more than their engines. Their training on the 747 was extensive, and between them they had decades of flying experience. But this situation was beyond anything they had ever experienced. As the pilots tried out this new way of controlling the plane, Tokyo Air Traffic Control came up with some options. The captain decided to return to Haneda rather than fly to Nagoya, which was closer. Haneda was bigger and had more emergency services. If he could make it to a runway, it would be a controlled crash rather than an emergency landing. He would need all the help he could get for his 509 passengers. The controller could hear the stress in the captain's voice, and to ease his workload, told him he could now speak in Japanese. Meanwhile, the flight engineer was on the intercom with the flight attendants in the back of the plane, trying to get a handle on what had happened. At this point, the pilots were still in the dark as to the nature of the damage to the aircraft. The stewardess told the flight engineer that the rear of the aircraft had been damaged and that a baggage compartment had collapsed. He passed this information on to the pilots and also told them that the passengers were all wearing their oxygen masks. But the two pilots didn't react. By this time, they were hypoxic and so overwhelmed by their desperate attempts to control the plane that they couldn't process what he was saying. Their situation would have been dire even without hypoxia, but with it, it became almost hopeless. The human brain makes up only 2% of the body's weight, but it consumes 20% of its oxygen. And the area of the brain that is most sensitive to a reduction in oxygen supply is the cortex, the thin layer of cells on the surface of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for higher-order functions such as problem-solving and complex tasks, exactly what the pilots needed in this emergency. The flight engineer continued to try to get through to the captain, pressing him on the need to start an emergency descent. This time, the pilots responded and agreed that they needed to put on their oxygen masks and start descending immediately, but that is not what happened. Unable to think clearly, the crew continued their fruitless battle with the aircraft's controls. On one front, however, they had made some progress. By carefully timing their movements of the throttle, the pilots had managed to dampen the plane's violent phugoid movements. It was still going up and down, but not as dramatically as before. This was a significant improvement in their situation and a source of hope for the crew. They had now demonstrated that they could control the aircraft's altitude, at least to some extent, using the engines alone. But they would have to do a lot more than just maintain altitude if they were to make it back to an airport. Japan Airlines contacted the pilots and asked them where they were. They had been informed by air traffic control that the plane was in distress, but they had no idea how bad the problem was. The flight engineer told them that the right-hand door at the rear of the aircraft had broken, perhaps fallen off. As it happened, it hadn't, but it was all he could read from his instruments as he tried to make sense of the plane's widespread failures. True enough, but at that moment the aircraft was not in an emergency descent. In fact, it hadn't descended at all. The plane was still bobbing up and down between 20,000 feet and At 25,000 feet, passengers sitting on the right-hand side of the plane could see Mount Fuji passing below them and just beyond the sprawling metropolis of Tokyo. It was so tantalizingly close and yet impossibly out of reach. If the crew were to return to the airport, they would have to descend. The first officer pushed the control column forward as hard as he could, but to no avail. It seemed that no matter how hard they tried, the pilots couldn't get the plane to descend. To have any hope, they would have to try something else. That's when the flight engineer had an idea. It was a good idea. Lowering the landing gear would slow the plane down, which would help it descend. It was unorthodox, but then so was everything else on that flight. But the captain didn't think it would be possible to lower the landing gear without hydraulic power. All the controls on the plane, apart from the engine throttle, had become mere decorations in the cockpit, cruel ornaments mocking the crew's near-total loss of control. But there was still one way the crew could lower the gear, if they could only think of it. On the 747, as on most aircraft, it's possible to lower the gear without using hydraulics, simply by letting it drop under its own weight. The flight engineer suggested this method to the captain. The captain wasn't sure he wanted to lower the landing gear just yet. He and the first officer had been trying for minutes to stabilize the aircraft's flight path and, against all odds, had achieved some success. By lowering the gear, they would risk throwing all that progress out the window, but in the end, the captain knew they had no choice. They were going to have to lower the gear at some point, so why not now? The pilots tried the alternative gear extension method. Slowly but surely, the 747's massive landing gear began to fall into the slipstream. A few moments later, they were down and locked in place. Aerodynamically, however, the results were mixed. On the one hand, the up and down motion of the aircraft had abated somewhat, but the Dutch roll had increased. Whatever the pilots did, it seemed they could only smooth one axis at a time, either the vertical or the horizontal, but not both. It was beginning to dawn on them that their situation might be hopeless, but they continued to fight. Now they were going to try to use the engines to steer the plane back to Tokyo. The first officer pushed the engines on the left side of the plane to high power and kept the engines on the right side at lower power. The plane continued to lurch from side to side, but gradually swung to the right, back towards the city. As the giant plane turned, Tokyo Control tried in vain to contact the crew, but nothing the controller could say would make any difference at that point. Early in their training, pilots are taught to fly, navigate, and communicate. That is the order of importance in flying an aircraft, and the pilots of Flight 123 were barely able to do the first of these, flying. Communicating with the ground was the last thing on their minds. The captain told his colleagues to ignore the controller and concentrate on flying the plane. With power to the engines reduced and the landing gear fully extended, the plane finally began to descend for the first time since leaving Tokyo. The plane was now below 20,000 feet. A few more thousand feet and the air would have enough oxygen for the pilots to breathe. By this time they were physically and mentally exhausted, and in their hypoxic state they didn't think to switch which thrust levers were producing high power to stop the turn as they began to head for Tokyo. Instead of switching and putting the right engines on a higher thrust setting, they had simply reduced thrust on all engines. The turn they had started with the intention of heading back to Tokyo now simply continued all the way around. In the cabin, the passengers' oxygen supply was beginning to run out. If the pilots didn't get the plane down to 10,000 feet soon, they too would become hypoxic. On the ground, shocked onlookers watched a 747 fly through the sky above them. Some took photographs of the aircraft. Despite the graininess of these two photos, the missing tail is clearly visible. Even from the ground, it was obvious that this plane was in extreme distress. But the only people who could do anything about it were the three men in the cockpit, and even they were barely hanging on. As the plane descended, the amount of oxygen in the air slowly began to rise. Gradually, the pilot's mental capacity returned. Mere reflex and semi-conscious reaction began to be replaced by conscious, deliberate thought. For the first time since the explosion, the crew were able to think about their situation rather than just react to it. And when they did, they realized the true gravity of the situation. A total loss of hydraulic power is an extremely rare event on a passenger aircraft, but on the few occasions it has happened, it hasn't ended well. The pilots of Flight 123 were well aware of this as they regained their composure at lower altitudes, but at the same time, they were now in a better position than ever to regain control of their aircraft. No longer suffering from the debilitating effects of hypoxia, they would finally be able to coordinate their problem-solving efforts and work together as a crew. In the cabin, a flight attendant announced to the passengers that they would soon be able to remove their oxygen masks. But this very saving grace, a lower altitude, now brought a new danger. Directly in front of the plane was a towering mountain range, but it wasn't clear that one turn would be enough to clear the mountains. They would also have to climb back to a higher altitude. With all engines at full power, the plane entered a steep climb, so steep that it was in danger of losing speed and stalling. The captain told the first officer to reduce power a little so they could continue the climb without making it too steep. But in its badly damaged state, making precise changes to the flight path was like performing brain surgery while wearing oven gloves. Controlling the plane's pitch using engine power alone was an incredibly crude technique, but it was the only option the pilots had. In just a few seconds, the plane had lost an enormous amount of speed. If it lost any more, it could stall and fall from the sky. The first officer pushed the control column all the way forward, but to no avail. Then he pulled the engines back almost to idle, and finally the plane began to pitch. But it was too much. The huge aircraft, now flying at just 9,000 feet, went into a terrifying dive. The pilots pushed all 4 throttles forward in a desperate attempt to pull the plane out of the dive. They were now dangerously close to the mountains, which began to block out the evening sun as the plane descended. In the midst of this struggle for survival, Tokyo Control attempted to contact the aircraft individually using the selective call system, which sounded ominously in the cockpit as the pilot struggled for control. With the engines at full power, the plane entered a rapid climb, the steepest the pilots had ever experienced. The nose was a full 40 degrees. Over the horizon, as the airspeed dropped rapidly, a new warning joined the fray. The stick shaker violently vibrated the pilot's controls, warning him of an impending stall. Once again, the plane entered a terrifying dive. The pilots knew this couldn't go on forever. They had become mere passengers in their own plane, reacting to its erratic movements as they happened. A witness on the ground later described the plane's movements as those of a staggering drunk. The pilots knew that to have any chance of saving their jet and its 521 passengers and crew, they had to try something else. The first officer suggested lowering the flaps. This would allow the plane to fly at a lower speed, reducing the risk of stalling. There was also a chance that they would add some much-needed stability to the plane's flight path. But without hydraulic power, the only way to lower the flaps was via the aircraft's auxiliary electrical system. The pilots activated this system and began lowering the flaps at a snail's pace. Using the electrical system instead of the much more powerful hydraulic system, the aircraft's flaps began to extend. The first officer continued his Herculean efforts to bring the huge aircraft under control, and this time it seemed to be working. By carefully timing the movements of the thrust levers, he had managed to stop the plane's roller coaster motion. For the first time since the emergency had begun, the aircraft was now flying approximately level. The crew were now cooperating fully, their minds no longer clouded by hypoxia. This was their chance. They had to get back to the airport now. The pilots contacted Tokyo Approach, but they were so disoriented by the plane's violent movements that they had completely lost track of where they were. How far away from Tokyo were they now? Where would they have to point the plane to get back there? The flight engineer asked the controller. They were 55 miles northwest of Haneda, not that far for a 747. They could cover that distance in a few minutes if they turned the plane around and headed for Tokyo. There was a chance they could make it back, and given their newfound stability, it was beginning to look possible. The first officer pushed the throttles forward to counteract the drag created by the flaps. But the flaps, which had initially helped the pilot to stabilize the aircraft, now slowly began to turn against him. Instead of stopping at a certain point, the flaps continued to extend. and as they did so, the flaps on the left wing began to extend further than those on the right wing. This created more lift on the left side of the aircraft, pulling that wing upwards and gradually turning the aircraft to the right. Degree by degree, the pilot's hard-won control began to slip away from them. As the plane banked to one side, the captain called for the flaps to be lowered further to 10 degrees. He didn't realize it, but by this time the flaps were already at 15 degrees and dropping by the second. The imbalance between the flaps on the left and right wing was getting worse. The first officer pushed the thrust levers forward, but for some reason he pushed the left side levers to a higher power setting than the right side levers. None of the crew noticed this, and the aircraft began to tip over. The aircraft was now on its side and sliding rapidly towards the mountains below. From this low altitude, there was little room to recover. The aircraft began to descend at over 18,000 feet per minute, 10 times the normal rate of descent. Instinctively, the pilots pulled back on the controls as hard as they could, but it was too late. The right wingtip and the outermost engine hit a ridge and were torn off. The plane turned on its back and slammed into the mountainside at hundreds of kilometers per hour, bursting into a huge fireball. Air traffic controllers watched helplessly as the plane disappeared from radar screens. They tried to contact the pilots but received no response. Just a minute later, their worst fears were confirmed when a Japanese military plane reported seeing a huge blaze in the Nagano Mountains. The U.S. Air Force had a plane flying nearby and offered to help search for survivors, even though it appeared there would be none. But the Japanese authorities refused, preferring to send their own rescue forces to the crash site. But because they didn't believe anyone had survived the crash, the Japanese didn't send their rescue teams to the crash site until dawn the next morning. A full 12 hours had passed by the time they arrived, and doctors on the scene said that passengers whose lives could have been saved if they had been found earlier had succumbed to their injuries during that time. Of the 524 passengers and crew, only 4 survived. They were all seated in the rear of the aircraft. This figure would probably have been higher had it not been for the disgracefully slow response of the Japanese authorities. As a result of this crash, Boeing redesigned the tail of the 747 so that rapid pressure surges in the tail would no longer cause the kind of structural failure that occurred on Flight 123. They also redesigned the plane's hydraulic systems and installed a fuse so that the loss of the tail would not result in a total failure of all 4 hydraulic systems. Japan Airlines also changed its maintenance procedures, introducing stricter oversight of major repairs and making regular inspections more thorough. The airline's public image suffered a severe blow as a result of the accident, with bookings nationwide falling by more than a third in the weeks following the crash. Flight 123 remains the world's worst single aircraft crash. If there's one good thing to come out of it, apart from the safety improvements made to the 747, it's that rescue operations are now carried out as soon as possible after an accident, regardless of the apparent survivability of the aircraft. Thank you for watching this episode. If you'd like to see more episodes like this, you can check out this playlist up here. And if you'd like to support the channel and join all these people, you can sign up on Patreon. I've put the link to that right here at the bottom of the screen. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.